Okay, we will start. First of all, good morning or good afternoon for all of you, and welcome to today's session organized by the WCA World Cement Association Zero Carbon and Environment Committee. The World Cement Association has been at the forefront of global effort to drive sustainability and innovation in the cement industry. And today's session. We are thrilled to have a very interesting presentation from Veyt, focusing on CBAM implications on the cement industry, with a special focus in the EU European Union ETS historical prices, market trends, in addition to deep dive into the industry trends and some decarbonization options also as well. Veyt, our presenters today, is a leading provider of data-driven insights and analytics for low carbon and renewable energy markets, empowering business and government to navigate the transition to a net zero economy. Veyt also offers very comprehensive market intelligence across key sectors, including renewable powers, carbon markets, and renewable fuels as well. Veyt, formerly known as GreenFact, was rebranded early in 2023 to reflect its expanded global focus and commitment to delivering objective forward-looking analysis. And the name Veyt is derived from Norwegian word vat, meaning no, underscoring the company's emphasis for knowledge, insights, and reliability, and the renewable and carbon markets as well. Veyt is very focused on renewable power purchase agreements, renewable fuels, and carbon markets in general, providing very comprehensive insights and forecasts for both compliance and voluntary carbon markets, also analysis for renewables, for renewable powers and renewable energy in general. Our presenters today are Harry Ohman and Henry Lash. Harry is a senior market analyst at Veyt, specialized in carbon market analysis with an experience in economics and management consultancy. Harry focuses on understanding the trade-off within carbon markets and the role they play in achieving climate goals. His work involves forecasting market outcomes, examining both policy and technology drivers of decarbonization as well. Harry is particularly specialized in the challenges faced by heavy industry in the energy transition, developing models to assess their decarbonization strategies within the EU ETS. He also contributes insights to cap and trade systems and voluntary market globally. Henry is also as well EU carbon analyst at Veyt. Henry focuses on policy analysis for the European Union emission trading system. He is working with historical data to refine models and test assumptions. Henry lead efforts to model changes in free allocation and planning due to the carbon border adjustment mechanism CBAM, aiming to provide clarity on associated cost and improvement of the EU ETS markets as well. Henry's main focus to equip industry with actionable insights for effective abatement decisions, believing carbon prices offer necessary flexibility for the green transition. With a master's degree of public administration from University of Bergen, Henry has a strong interest in the environment politics and the EU ETS role in emission reductions as well. I will let the floor now for Henry and Harry. They have very interesting presentation. And as I said, they will cover CBAM, EU ETS, historical prices, cement inflows and outflows from Europe, and some models they prepared for cement industry as well. Welcome, Henry and Harry.
Thank you very much. All right, yeah. So let's dive into it. So we to start out here, I wanted to talk a bit kind of basics. What is CBAM? How is this going to deal with the cement industry? How are these going to interact? So to start out with that, Harry, if you go to the next slide. I wanted to give a quick overview of what the EU ETS is, because I'm certain there's some that aren't so into the ETS side of things, maybe more into the CBAM side. So the emissions trading system is a cap and trade system through which the EU is working to achieve its climate targets. They've pegged a target at 55% emission reduction by 2030. If they want to reach that, then specific industries are going to have to reduce their emissions by a certain level. So through the ETS, there's an annually decreasing level of emissions, a cap, that can be allowed by industry, by power generation, and by aviation. The EU then auctions off or gives out a number of allowances, or EUAs, which is equal to that yearly level of emissions. These can then be bought or sold by utilities or by industry, excuse me, or by financials. And by doing this, then they're creating future scarcity for emissions, which is providing a price signal now for polluters to either buy allowances at a steadily increasing price or to put in the investments that are needed to lower their emissions. So in combination with a robust reporting and verification system, this emissions pricing provides flexibility for individual plants to kind of make the decisions that the rational choices for the most effective way for reducing emissions and ensuring that the EU hits their climate goals. So far, it's proven to be a pretty effective system. So it's reduced emissions, ETS covered emissions steadily since 2005, but it also poses challenge for industry by imposing that additional cost. And that additional cost is where CBAM comes into play. Great. So CBAM exists to level the playing field in the EU market between domestic and foreign producers. It was introduced as a way to challenge carbon leakage, which carbon leakage is the concept that because of the EU price, the carbon price, EU production can then be outsourced to jurisdictions with a less stringent environmental policy or less stringent environmental policy. And the impact of that carbon leakage is then twofold. It increases overall global emissions by whenever this production takes place in regions with less control over their industrial emissions. And EU-covered companies suffer as costs that are not faced by third countries then harm competitiveness, which gives rise to greater competition from imports and greater competition in export markets. So up to now, that policy solution, the way that the EU has dealt with this has been within the EU ETS through free allocation by basically, so if you're a cement company, a big chunk of your EUAs that you need for annual compliance are given for free rather than having to buy them on the market, which then reduces the carbon costs that you have and improves your competitiveness relative to third country producers. But there's a couple of problems with this. One, the whole point of the cap and trade system is to impose a cost on emissions, which needs to be sufficient to drive investments in the improved carbon efficiency, which that free allocation, by providing them for free, it partially takes away that investment signal. Historically, there's also been over allocation. So industry has received too many allowances for free, which has allowed them to gain an unearned windfall profit without really reducing emissions. And then the third element is the pass-through costs from energy. So power generation utilities are able to pass through the costs that they have through the carbon market directly to end consumers, which means that while they're protected from some of the carbon costs, their indirect costs are still exposed. And it's some exposure that is not faced by third country producers. CBAM is the solution to this, or this is what the EU has put forward as the solution. So instead, as you can see on the left-hand side here, instead of having that free allocation reduce the costs, instead those costs are going to be applied to imports or to third country producers. So at its surface, the CBAM is a carbon border tax, but there's a couple of functions within there as well. It covers cement, fertilizers, hydrogen, iron and steel, and electricity imports. And it's going to impose a cost on emissions that's equal to that paid by EU producers. This essentially works by non-EU producers providing their data, their production and their emissions data to EU buyers. And then these importers are reporting that data to the EU Commission, and then they need to buy CBAM certificates equal to the volume of embedded emissions. These CBAM certificates then carry the same price as the EU price to ensure that the cost is levelized between the two systems. So while third country producers are not directly facing the cost of EU carbon, their imported products are going to be losing competitiveness, losing that competitive advantage of not paying for carbon emissions within the EU market. The central idea is that this is going to incentivize sustainable practices and investments in abatement, both for EU producers as the cost starts to bite, and for extra EU producers by penalizing the least efficient industry. So the point I want to reiterate here is that this is happening. So CBAM reporting is already going on, and purchases are starting, actually it's delayed by 1 year, but the financial impact of CBAM is beginning from next year. On this slide, we have on the left here, we have a timeline for that implementation schedule. On the right-hand side, we have the trajectory for the phase-in and the phase-out. So CBAM implementation, it's been criticized kind of the whole way through for a bit of lack of clarity, the administrative complexity. It's an incredibly complicated system. And then also a lack of visibility for foreign producers that are unfamiliar with the ETS. There's been complaints at the WTO and bilateral complaints, and there have been within the EU as well, there have been kind of rumblings about how effective is this policy going to be? Is it going to be sufficient? Can we close the loopholes? But at this point, I do want to emphasize that for those that are holding out hope that it's not going to be implemented, that it'll be delayed, that's not going to happen. CBAM is happening and it is going forward. For those that are unfamiliar with the EU legislative process, CBAM is already in law in the CBAM regulation in the EU ETS directive. And at this point, the technical calibrations are what need to come into play now. So it's just secondary legislation determining some of the methodologies behind it. As it stands now, since 2023, we already have the reporting ongoing, even though there are no financial implications yet. But this year we've had a couple of updates with CBAM. There has, with the Clean Industrial Deal, the EU's Clean Industrial Deal, they put forward the omnibus package, which seeks to simplify CBAM. I mean, among other things, but it seeks to simplify CBAM. Basically, what this is going to do is raise the threshold for CBAM compliance, ensuring that smaller consignments and smaller companies are not going to be impacted or burdened with the additional bureaucracy or the complex reporting. There are a couple additional tweaks, including simplifying reporting methodologies. The simplification is also pushing CBAM certificate purchases to 2027. And even though this looks like a delay, it's not actually a delay, because those emissions from 2026 are still going to be facing a financial obligation, but it is just basically it's just the purchase of CBAM certificates that's delayed. So it's essentially it looks like a delay, but it's not a delay. Those costs are going to be faced. They're just going to be faced a year later. That's when those purchases need to be made. The legislation that is going to be simplifying the CBAM is going through at the moment. It's been through a couple of committees within the European Parliament, but broadly there haven't been a lot of changes that have been made. There's quite wide consensus on it. Most of the amendments that have been proposed have been aimed at raising or lowering thresholds for compliance. In Q3, we're going to be having a commission review of CBAM, which will kick off some additional reforms. The current debate at the moment suggests that this review is going to center around supporting competitiveness for EU exports of CBAM goods. There'll be expansion of CBAM to downstream products, and ensuring that there are protections in place against circumvention of CBAM costs by importers and by third country producers. And that will take into account processes or circumvention methods like resource shuffling or improper data, etc. So that's what's ongoing at the moment. For 2026, we're going to be entering the definitive period when the phase-in is going to be starting. Like I said, that kind of delay, the delay that's not a delay, is happening. So CBAM certificates are going to be purchased in February 2027. but that'll be for 2.5% and then gradually ramping up. At the same time, free allocation is going to be ramping down. That is the graph on the right-hand side. I want to emphasize here that for as much as these trajectories represent an increase in cost for importers, they're also going to be representing an increase in cost for EU industry as we're moving that free allocation towards zero in 2034. Fundamentally, CBAM is about trade in industrial products. So I want to look here at the EU cement trade. The chart on the left-hand side here is displaying the largest importers of cement to the EU. It's generally regionally bound and compared to total production, not incredibly heavily traded, with the largest importers being in the neighboring regions in North Africa, Balkans, Eastern Europe, and Turkey. The EU consumes roughly 180 million tons of cement annually, but most of that is produced domestically, with only around 7% of total EU demand being met by imported production. That said, as you can see in the chart on the right, cement imports to the EU have increased pretty sharply in the last years. Going back to 2016, actually, it was I think it was 2 million tons of cement, which has increased to about 12 million tons last year. During the same period, the EU cost of carbon has jumped from about 30 per ton up to 100 per ton, and then back down to around 70 euros per ton at the moment. Now, this surge in imports is the scenario that the Commission and CBAM are really pushing to deter, which is the import of emissions-intensive products in order to avoid carbon pricing within the bloc. So this here is in order to give an indication of what type of costs that we're going to be that are going to be applied to imported cement. I put together a breakdown of the equation that the EU is going to be using to determine the CBAM cost. For this example, we're using a hypothetical Turkish plant, which is operating at the average emissions intensity for the country, producing and selling about 200,000 tons of gray clinker to a client in the EU, and that's the jumping off point for this. The equation starts with the Joint Research Council's estimate of emissions intensity for clinker production in Turkey. And then that next series here, the CBAM benchmark and the CBAM factor, work to make the phase-in, basically to make the phase-in of CBAM equivalent to the phase-out of the free allocation to EU industry. The difference then between these values is going to provide the emissions per ton of product that importers of non-EU goods are going to pay when we apply the carbon price, and then the volume, which this is going to give us the annualized cost associated with this product and with this volume. So up to 2026, any carbon cost for clinker has effectively been zero. And then despite only a 2.5% phase in 2026, that additional carbon cost for the importer of the cement is going to jump to about 3.9 million euros. By 2034, an importer is going to pay an additional 46.8 million euros in CBAM costs for Turkish cement. With over the 9 years of the phase-in, that sum is going to be reaching around 189.2 million, which is pretty huge. But this is still only half the picture. If we want to take a look at how the full picture for CBAM, we have to take a look at competitiveness. According to the Joint Research Council, compared to foreign trading partners, the European Union has the edge whenever it comes to carbon efficiency. So if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, when compared against all the EU's largest cement importing countries, the EU has an edge when it comes to emissions intensity. They're sitting at around 0.81 tons of CO2 per ton of clinker, whereas on the opposite side of the chart, we have Bosnia sitting at about 0.93 tons per ton of clinker. The edge here for EU producers lies in their comparatively heavy use of sustainable biomass as fuel. Under the EU system, this is zero rated, so rated as zero emissions. And then typically this is done because of carbon costs. This is why EU producers use biofuel rather than traditional methods. This carbon efficiency edge, whenever we're applying CBAM, translates then into a cost advantage for these domestic producers. So if you look at the graph on the right, you see it's a slight cost advantage per ton of product, and that grows through the years. I mean, the margin stays the same, but the important number to pay attention here, or the numbers to pay attention, is the difference between the carbon cost of both markets and the counterfactual as well. So understand that, like, without CBAM, this chart would look quite differently, with Turkish producers paying nothing for carbon versus EU producers facing gradually increasing carbon costs. So as it is on the chart, the margin it's not so substantial when we're talking about the overall rise in carbon costs, both from the ETS and the CBAM. But if we go to the next slide, and then we apply that same 200,000 ton volume of clinker, which we used in the previous example, the marginal cost differential means big money. So in 2026, largely because of the difference in carbon efficiency, that Turkish clinker exporter has a carbon cost disadvantage of 1.3 million euros. And then if we look to the table on the right-hand side, it shows that in 2034, the cumulative Turkish cost premium to the EU clinker will rise to 19 million euros. Now, just to note, this is a static picture. So we're looking at today's efficiency gap carried forward over the next 9 years. But still, these are the numbers that EU importers are going to be looking at whenever they're making decisions about where they want to source their cement and how much more it's going to be costing them. The real cost of CBAM for third country producers beyond the additional emissions accounting and the administrative complexity is the loss of competitiveness within the EU market that they're going to be facing. So if you take anything out of this presentation, that would be the highlight. So it is possible to mitigate CBAM costs a couple of ways, but the feasibility and the benefit of each play a role here. So at the first level here on the left-hand side, we got the country level. So for governments, if an emissions trading system or a carbon cost is put into place, then the carbon cost paid through that system will be deducted from the CBAM obligation. Now, this seems like a boon for third country producers, but in practice, the price paid is actually going to be the same. The cost would then be split between the carbon price paid by the producer in the third country and the CBAM price paid by the importers. This scenario really benefits the third country government, as the carbon revenues would then flow to them rather than to the European Union. I would caveat this here by saying that the benefit could flow to third country producers if the governments then decide to use these revenues to support industrial abatement, which is what the EU has done. But again, the benefit is mainly to the countries that would be receiving the revenue. At this point, we've seen a couple of ETSs that have been popping up. The Turkish ETS, there's been movement in Brazil as well, and in India. China has expanded theirs. But at this point, there's no indication that pricing anywhere other than the UK is going to be at a comparable level. Well, I guess the US has a couple of markets with relatively high prices, but other than the UK, nothing is at the same level as the EU. At the plant level, the main strategy to remain competitive within a carbon pricing regime is to implement carbon efficiency improvements. So as we were looking at in the previous slides, that margin between EU producers and third country producers determines the cost premium. For the calculations of the presentation, I used national averages, but if individual plants are going to be able to improve their efficiency relative to EU producers, that's going to be reflected in the data reported to importers, and then ultimately the associated carbon cost, which is going to improve relative competitiveness. So another strategy is through power purchase agreements as well. This only applies to costs associated with indirect emissions stemming from electricity usage, which is only a small portion of the total risk. But producers that use PPAs for renewable energy can then report their actual lower values rather than their grid average that would otherwise be used. So it'd probably knock off about 0.02 to 0.05 tons of CO2 per ton of clinker. I mean, I'm still using the clinker example in my head here, but it is also a way to lower their risk. For the importer, then, that's going to be paying the cost. We have some flexibility within the CBAM regulation. There's a small amount of flexibility that is built into it as well. Importers are able to hold their CBAM certificates for a 2-year period, so essentially can buy a year ahead when carbon costs are slightly cheaper. These certificates, I mean, except for the first year, of course, these certificates can then also be resold to the Commission if they're unused, and then they'll be resold at the price at which they were purchased, just up to a specific threshold, though. I think it's proposed to be about 50% of an annual emissions. If they have knowledge of the EU market, purchases of CBAM certificates can also be timed, again, up to a certain point, up to a quarterly threshold, to take some advantage of the change in prices. and seasonality within the European carbon market. But overall, because these flexibility measures are going to be limited and shorter term, 1 to 2 year horizon, it's difficult to effectively lock in carbon costs for the long term. There's limited hedging within this strategy. And also, as CBAM certificates can only be purchased by importers or their representatives, this is not really going to do anything for third country producers. The final option that we have here is listed under importers, but it can also apply to third country producers as well. And that is participation in the European Union, or the EU ETS. So CBAM certificates are tied directly to the cost of EUAs, and they're going to be fluctuating with the market, as they're going to be reflecting the weekly average of EU ETS auction prices. The EUAs can function effectively as a direct hedge against CBAM cost exposure. The EUA futures market is mature, it's highly liquid, price signals are transparent, and drivers are well established and highly visible. There's also futures contracts that forward futures contracts around, I think the furthest out is about 8 years, which is also supportive of long-term planning. So importers can take advantage of this, but also third country producers. They can either interact in the market directly or through intermediaries in the secondary market as a way to financially hedge their exposure to EU carbon costs and the volatility. That's kind of essential to it. Essentially, one way or the other, you're going to be exposed to the price of the EU ETS. So you can use the system itself to lock in your cost exposure. Although doing this kind of requires some understanding of what actually drives the market. Now we're going to move into EU ETS territory, talking a little bit about the EU ETS, what drives the market, and then Harry's going to take over for some industry stuff as well. So at Veyt, this is what we do. We deal with market reports that cover short and long-term drivers, along with other kind of in-depth analysis. But to give an overview here, historically, EUA prices have reacted to energy markets, to headlines, to policy, and to participant behavior. On the demand side, carbon tends to follow gas prices closely and often takes direction from the market. And the reasoning behind this is there's a complex relationship with coal, gas, and power prices. So under normal market conditions, the carbon price adds costs to fossil power generation. When these costs are lower, when carbon costs are lower, it makes coal burn less expensive. When more coal is burned, it drives higher demand for EU carbon allowances, which then drives higher carbon prices. And then when these EUA prices are higher, it adds sufficient cost to coal generation, where it makes more sense to switch to a less carbon-intensive fuel, which in this case would be gas. So the interplay between these markets requires participants to closely follow developments in each. So you can see in the graph on the left-hand side here, when prices are above the EUA switching price, gas burn tends to be incentivized. When it's below, coal burn tends to be incentivized. So it tends to equalize, and there is often a quite close correlation, which is why participants follow very closely with each of these markets. On the supply side, carbon closely follows policy as well. It's a politically created market, which the rules of the system are subject to change and to reform. So changes in policy or even sentiment around maybe climate ambition or ongoing debate to loosen climate ambition can send signals as to how tight the market is going to be in the future and when it's going to be tighter. So it can often prompt price reactions. Short term, carbon is not immune to broader macroeconomic sentiment either. This has recently been pretty apparent with the US tariff announcements. We've seen prices sharply dropping on the 2nd of April when Donald Trump announced the 20% tariffs on EU products. Investment funds are very active within the EU market, and whenever there's a crisis in financial markets, it often spills over into carbon, even if there's not an immediate fundamental link between the two markets. And then finally, we have participant behavior. So essentially, when the market is boring, when there's no clear directional drivers, tools like technical analysis come into play. So essentially, traders are all looking at the same charts and the same moving averages at the same ticks. There are recognizable patterns that emerge just from trading behavior that can also move prices. Here we have a zoomed out view of how the EU carbon price has developed over time. I've highlighted a couple of various policy and energy developments that have moved prices across the years. But I want to also highlight the volatility of the market that cement producers and importers are going to soon be exposed to. If we look closer at some of these movements, we can see it's these rapid price dynamics. They're driven by the short-term drivers that I was describing in the previous slide. But when we zoom out, we can see that the longer-term trend of rising prices, this is directly impacted by the supply tightening impact of policy decisions and the decarbonization that is available to industry. For more on that, Harry, you can take over and talk a little bit more about the longer-term elements.
Thank you, Henry. I will be starting to talk about our long-term price forecast. So what we will be seeing going forward with the carbon price, because as Henry has pointed out quite eloquently and often through this presentation, is that third-party producers of cement will be exposed to this price. So what we see happening going forward, if we look at the top left-hand side chart, we see that this year we believe that the average carbon price within the EU will be 80 euros per ton. And then we think this will increase to 195 euros per ton, so more than a doubling to 2030. And then going from 2030 to 2035, not another doubling, but almost 50% increase to 290 euros per ton of CO2. This is nominal prices. So this is quite a hefty increase in the carbon price. What drives this? Well, one clue we can see in the chart below, which is the market balance chart, which is a tool that a lot of EU ETS traders look at, but it essentially says that the line is the cumulative number of allowances in circulation. So allowances that participants in the markets hold, but are not using for compliance. And we see how that is quite high at the moment. But because the incremental balance, the annual balance, which is the bars, are negative, this year we think it's going to be zero, but going forward it's going to be negative every year. This means we're going to eat up this cumulative supply of allowances that's been built up. And that will send a signal of tightness to the markets, will drive prices up. Looking at the right-hand side chart, we see the true reasoning behind this, and that is the EU ETS cap trajectory. So what I show here is the presumed cap trajectory going from 2021 and then all the way to 2040, where we see landing at zero. The 2040 level is not set in stone, but this is what we believe is the most likely, going to be the most likely outcome. In addition to that, we have the emissions from the without additional measures scenario from the EU Commission. So something akin to a business as usual scenario for emissions. And as you can see, there's some sort of wedge between this business as usual scenario and the cap trajectory. And the wedge between these two scenarios is what the EU ETS will have to cover by increasing the incentives to decarbonize as we go out through time. And that is substantial in 2040 and even in 2035. And that's the main reason we have why we believe that there will be high prices going forward. Now, I'm going to do a little bit of a quick whistle-stop tour through our industry analytics. It's at quite a high level, but just to give you an idea of what we think this means for EU producers going forward. Because what EU industries will do will have an impact for third-party producers and for CBAM, as if the EU producers manage to decarbonize somewhat cheaper, just cheaper than the EU carbon price, that will mean that they will increase their competitiveness compared to foreign producers. Right, so just high-level picture of EU industry. So EU industry, in terms of emissions, is dominated by basic manufacturing, right? So on the left here, I have this nice donut chart which breaks down the emissions in the EU ETS system for 2023. In the innermost donut, we have the high-level segments, power and heat. aviation and industry. And as you can see, aviation industry was 51%. This is going to increase over time. Industry is going to become more and more dominant, and it's going to be more and more focus on these industry players with the ETS system. If we then go out to the outer ring of the donut, we have steel, oil and gas, cement, and chemicals as the largest segments within industry, and then there's a big long tail of the smaller sectors. This is again in terms of emissions, right? So if we think about what's happened with these sectors over time, I've shown here in this graph both production and emissions for the 4 largest industrial segments. And as you can see, industrial production and emissions have been tightly linked. So a large chunk of the emissions reductions that we've seen in industry, compared to what we've seen in power, have been due to reduction in production, rather than in reduction in sort of deployment of more sort of deep decarbonization options. Looking at cement, it's quite an interesting example. That's there we've started to see the divergence that EU policy makers would like to see. We see the emissions, the blue line there, which is the emissions trajectory, and the yellow production line, which is the production, have kind of diverged, where the production has stayed somewhat stable or stayed at the level of 2014 at least, and the emissions have gone down. This is because, to a large extent, because as Henry alluded to, they have sort of to use biomass in larger quantities. If we then move to the next slide, like we don't believe that biomass can completely solve the picture of cement producers. Partly because well, it can only ever solve your the energy emissions, related to fuel use, and not the process emissions that you also have in the cement sector, right? But secondly, the biomass, we believe, will become scarcer and scarcer as time goes by, and that means that prices will likely to increase. They're already at 2 to 3 times what we have for fossil fuels prices, but we think this will go up. So what I've done in this chart is that I've taken data from this Green Cement Tracker, which tracks cement projects and CCS in cement projects. I've taken all projects in the EU, and then I've taken projects which are full-scale projects, which have been up, where we've seen some update in the last 2 years. So not projects that were announced 10 years ago, and it was a press release, so we haven't seen anything about. So something that where we at least heard something about this project in the last 2 years. Some of them are in very early stages to be emitted. Added up from the date they are to come online. I've added cumulative capacity throughout Europe in terms of capture capacity, and using a very simple back of the envelope calculation, calculated what we think that means for cement making capacity that's been equipped with some form of CCS solution. And we can see that given this announced project, there will be a massive increase in these types of projects over the coming years, assuming all of the projects that have been announced will actually come online, which is a big if, right? So it'll almost doubling in the starting phase, and then we will have annual doubling up till 2030, and then a slower increase after 2030 onwards, and landing in 2032. Almost 18% of EU cement making capacity being equipped with some form of CCS solution, obviously reducing their CO2 footprints for third-party producers. Now, finally, before I hand over to questions here, I just like to show this chart, which is our projection of what will actually happen, and we have kind of dampened these expectations a little bit. We believe that these projects of CCS projects are difficult to pull off, and that we are unlikely to see any large scale projects or before 2030, or not much of it before 2030. But from 2030 onwards, as we believe there will be a high carbon price, we believe that a lot of these projects will be in the money, and that we will start seeing substantial deployment of these kind of technologies. leading to large reductions in emissions and emissions intensity.
Okay, thank you, Harry. Thank you, Henry. Thank you for the presentation. We have a lot of questions, a lot of interesting questions. Some related specifically to cement, and others are related to the market and policies and the tariffs. So our first question is asking about Trump tariffs and CBAM. How will the tariff regime factor into CBAM implementation?
Yes, Trump tariffs and CBAM. Well, I mean, so I think obviously CBAM is an example of it. It's two things right now that would be very high on Donald Trump's agenda, which is trade and potentially trade barriers and climate, which he's on a bit of a warpath against at the moment. But when it comes to the actual impact on CBAM, I would imagine that this is something that he will. I mean, if someone tells him about it, it'll be pushed back against pretty heavily. But when it comes to actual trade between the U.S. and the EU, the EU actually exports quite a bit of cement to the U.S. So in the event that there is that these tariffs are going to go through and will be applied to that cement that is being sent to the U.S., it's possible that kind of undermines. If it's rerouted, it's more likely to be rerouted domestically, and potentially some of that oversupply is going to be used in domestic markets, potentially pushing out some imports. But at the moment, it doesn't seem like there's going to be a major impact. And I don't think that there's any chance that pushback on CBAM from the United States is going to disrupt the implementation of CBAM anyway. Any thoughts on that, Harry?
No, I think you put it very well. CBAM, cement is not very traded. I mean, we're not exporting a lot of cement, or we're exporting quite a bit of cement to the US, but they're not importing from them, so they're not directly impacted of them. So yeah, it's a good, yeah.
Okay, another question also is talking about what is predicted to be the impact of the Commission's proposal to delay to buy CBAM certificates to 1st of February 2027 on the ETS EUA due to different hedging strategies, for example.
Yeah, so I don't see that as having a major impact at least on the EU ETS price. I think that the delay potentially, if because there is a delay of the CBAM certificate sales to 2027 for 2026 emissions, there's less ability for importers to manage that risk using the flexibility within the CBAM system. So it's possible they turn instead to the EU ETS. But that being said, it's a financial risk, or it's a financial hedge using EUAs to hedge your CBAM price risk, meaning it's cap neutral essentially. So there might be some additional demand for EUAs, but those EUAs are going to stay out in the market. So there shouldn't be a fundamental impact on the market. I guess at this point, it just depends on the number of companies that are going to be looking to EUA proxy hedging as a strategy to manage the risk.
Yeah. I used to let that out. I mean, there's two things that's going to happen at once, right? There's the phase out of the free allocations and the CBAM, and what the impact of both of them will be is somewhat uncertain. Henry said that for the CBAM, I guess it's just about what the appetite will be for doing proxy hedging. A lot of it, and then you could definitely see impacts on prices. Yeah, on free allocations, there's a bit of a debate on whether that will have prices or impact. price impacts. I mean, theoretically speaking, it should not have that much price impact. The incentives should be same, but I think there's a widely held belief in the EU ETS community that as the EU industrials will have to face the actual cost of EUAs, there will be a psychological impact that they will start taking things more seriously, and that will drive up demand and as such prices.
We have a complex question related to free allocation, and it's a compound question. Is this 0.693 is free allocation set now for clinker? Is there a similar one for cement? And if it is for the cement product, so this is the first part of the question. And is this set as a stone, this number, or can be changed from here to 2034? This free allocation number can be changed or not? Also, another question related to the price of CBAM certificates. It will, as we understand, it will be implemented effectively from 1st of January 2026, but companies might pay in 2027. So what is the price the companies will pay in 2027? It will be depending on also weekly average, or it will be what will be the price in 2027 of CBAM certificates? I know it is a very big question.
No, it's okay. I'm happy to take it. I'll start with the benchmark question, and I'll move into the I guess the delay, the CBAM not delay but delay. So the first part about the benchmark being set in stone. CBAM, no, it is not set in stone. We're using, this is an assumption that we're making because we don't have CBAM benchmarks yet from the Commission. So what we're doing is basically saying, okay, what is the benchmark that's used in the EU ETS? So realistically, this is actually probably an underestimate of what this will be. So there is going to be a benchmark update exercise that's going to take place before 2026. So for the period 2026 to 2030, where there's going to be new benchmarks in place that are going to be more stringent than this one. The rule, I mean, within the CBAM legislation is that the CBAM benchmark should be relatively close to the EU ETS benchmark because there is supposed to be equivalency between the two systems. So very likely it's going to be lower than this, the benchmark will be. So that will impose costs both on EU producers and on third country producers and importers. Oh, and the second question, I forgot there was two. The second was about, let's see, is it going to be the weekly average? Or actually, I think that one is laid out. And this is, again, this is tentative because it is ongoing legislation, but we expect the legislation to go forward as it is. And I'd have to check the specific details on this, but I'm fairly certain it's going to be a quarterly price, and then imports will be tied. The CBAM certificates for those quarters are going to be tied to the average price for that quarter, essentially. That sounds a little bit complicated, but it is.
And for cement, there is benchmark for or free allocation for cement products. And because this 0.693 is clinker related free allocation, but I don't know if there is one for cement or it is expected to be for cement.
That's so actually that's why I think that there will be one for cement. The reason I used 0.693 was because it's one it's directly transferable. We can pretty clearly see what the two are. So I think it's quite comparable. Whenever I'm doing my kind of looking at the assessments here, what I tend to do is I look at the current EU benchmark and kind of how the benchmarks are based. And I apply it's about a 15% reduction to whatever the weighted average is. And that's where I was thinking for gray clinker and for cement products. I mean, it's kind of a pretty basic way to do it before we have the setup, but the benchmark tends to be, or at least the clinker benchmark is about 0.15%, or 15% below the weighted average of clinker across Europe.
Yeah.
And I would suspect that it's going to be something similar for other cement products as well.
Do you think the current LRF will be maintained if carbon prices were really to reach more than €200 per ton CO2 from 2030 onwards, given the recent focus on competitiveness rather than decarbonization?
Maybe we can have a quick stab. I mean, currently we don't. It's hard to. You should never say never. But the policy makers in the EU seem quite intent on keeping the EU legislation as is intact and the environmental mission intact. With regards to prices being somewhere north of 200, this is not that prices would have to end up in these regions. It's not news to people who follow this closely. I mean, we've known that we would have to have substantial carbon prices to get to the ambitious targets that EU has set for themselves. So that's that. I would tentatively say that I think that this will be accepted, and there will be other additional measures to support industry where necessary to retain industrial capacity and competitiveness. You would rather support them in addition to the system in other ways, rather than scrap this altogether. Henry, do you have any other views on this?
Yeah, I just was going to say, I mean, we have a 2040 target that's going to be coming up with the Commission, and we know where we have to be by 2050. So I think it's a question of how, I mean, policymakers and particularly Hoekstra has been very supportive of carbon pricing, particularly the EU ETS. I think that we can absolutely expect ambition to be maintained with the system that has been working well up to this point.
Another question about verification process for non-European producers. What will be the process? It will be similar to the verification process, if it will be similar to ETS, or and when is expected to start?
Sorry, I'm trying to see the question in front of me. No, yeah, I don't think I have too much to say on the verification side. I feel like I've not followed the verification elements very particularly closely. I think that the expectation, though, is that the stringency should mirror the EU ETS, and that's kind of the message across the board. Is one should be more or less equal to the other, as close as we can do it.
Also, a question is: there is only one default value in CBAM for ammonia, no matter its use either for fertilizers or hydrogen. It's not cement related, but or if we will produce hydrogen or something like that. Is that it will have the same CBAM impact as fertilizers, or?
As far as I am aware, I have not seen any differentiation there. So as far as I have seen, yes, but I would have.
We lost
him, but yes, I think that's absolutely what we can expect.
We have also another. It's somehow cement related. Somehow, how is the calcined clay and other SCMs will be counted in CBAM? How is the EU imported recycled cement handled within CBAM, and what audit methodology does this assume also for the recycled cement? The calcined clay have a similar, I know from my knowledge, have a similar reporting methodology like the cement clinker.
Yeah.
I know that. SCMs, I think it will depend on its industry. If it is industrial byproduct, it will be also counted in CBAM. This is my knowledge, up to my knowledge. my cement knowledge. But if you have
Yes.
more to illustrate also, it will be good.
No, I think I agree with that assessment, and I think we'll have to for SCMs, it's probably going to be dependent on what SCM you're talking about, and you have to follow those closely.
Yeah, okay. We have some market related, carbon market related, third countries carbon markets. What markets are developing, and how would these carbon markets interact with the EU CBAM? We see Turkey is intending to make a similar system for ETS, or I don't have a lot of information, and I know there is other countries also is intended.
Yeah. I think I mean, the biggest one is of course UK, which is a bit of a special case because they used to be part of the EU ETS, and they're also building up their own CBAM, and we'd expect there. So that's obviously one thing, and we'd expect some sort of simplification there or light linking, because in the long term at least, because otherwise producers there are several producers exposed to both of these markets, and they would then have to keep track of 4 different carbon pricing mechanisms, which would be especially onerous on them. In addition to that, I think Henry mentioned Turkey, and then Brazil we've seen going up. But what's also important to remember is that you need to have carbon, and we have China, of course, which could be significant in this part, but none of this. It's not you could say they have a carbon price, right? But they don't have a carbon price almost on the same order of magnitude as the EU has. So they have to have a carbon price also at the same, either carbon tax at the same level, or cap and trade system with some sort of similar ambition to what the EU has, and both having a carbon price system and having that ambition, we haven't really seen, except for UK and possibly some of the North American system, but we're not. They're not major. The US is not a major, trading partner for most of these sectors that we're talking about in the EU ETS.
What is the impact do you foresee to start CBAM will have on the EU pricing? Will the CBAM certificate generate any increase or in demand for the EUA's pricing or something like that?
Yeah, I think we kind of touched upon that earlier, and I think that again, just to reiterate that answer, it's about like whether we see a great appetite for proxy hedging, right? That could drive some demand, speculative demand, and then on the other hand, what will happen with free allocation phase out, and how that will change the incentives or at least the perceived incentives of the covered entities within the system. I think the intuition that I have, and that probably many analysts share, is that it will be tighter and the prices will be higher once they start coming into effect. But it's at this point more of an intuition than rather than a kind of a modeling insight.
If the CCS project can not uphold cement making capacity, is the CCS project a good investment to decarbonize the industry?
I think we are at time, but I can give you a quick thing. CCS in industry in general, I think our view is that it kind of a little bit depends on the process, whether you have alternatives, where alternatives are often better. But then also, and here I'm sure there's a couple of engineers on the call, but as I understand it, it has to do with what levels of concentration of CO2 you can get in the process stream from which you want to capture the CO2, right? So in cement, it's assumed that you can get a bit higher CO2 concentration, which means that you will have a lower capture cost than, for example, putting it on an energy plant or something. So that's that might be a better option, but you should also say we have quite high prices in the EU. So our assumption is that it will be financially a good option for some EU producers. Yes.
I know we are getting out of time. So I would like to thank you both, Harry and Henry, for this beautiful presentation. Very insightful, a lot of data and a lot of analysis. And sorry for if we cannot answer any of the questions. Lot of questions. We have over 30 something questions in the panel. I would like to thank also the attendees and for their participation, very active participation. One of the most interactive sessions I have ever attended. Thank you all, and I will thank you all for that as well. Thank you, Harry.
Thank you. I think
Thank you.
we can share the slides afterward with the participants.
Yes.
And we'll try
Yes.
to answer some questions as well bilaterally with people sent them in the chat. So
Yeah. Okay. That would be great. Thank you.
thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.